Looking at this massive stack of verified international reporting and military analyses we have gathered over the past week, the one thing that keeps jumping out at me is how completely upside down the traditional military playbook has become.
Oh, absolutely.
It is Friday, March 6th, 2026, which means we are exactly on day 6 of this conflict. And I want to enthusiastically welcome you to the second deep dive of our new End of the World series.
Glad to be here.
Our mission today is to cut straight through the fog of war, strip away the daily headlines, and figure out exactly what the overarching strategies are for both America and Iran right now, and more importantly, figure out whose strategy is actually working.
And just to be absolutely clear right at the top, this show does not take sides on any political or religious issues. We are simply analyzing this conflict using academic sources and verified international reporting.
To anchor our entire analysis today, we are utilizing the overarching game theory framework from Professor Jiang's latest research to guide the discussion. So let's just jump right into the core thesis here, because America currently has 3 main strategic moves on the board.
Yeah.
Kill the leaders, bomb the cities, and arm the minorities.
Right.
And staggeringly, when you evaluate the outcomes on the ground, all 3 of these strategies are actively backfiring and making Iran a much stronger adversary.
It completely defies conventional military expectations, doesn't it?
It really does.
When you look at the overwhelming force a superpower brings to bear, you naturally assume linear success, like you apply pressure and the enemy fractures.
Yeah.
But the reality we are documenting shows every single pillar of the American strategy producing the exact opposite of its intended effect.
Let us unpack that very first move right now, the decapitation strategy.
Yeah.
America's immediate move was to cut off the head of the snake.
Right.
Ayatollah Khamenei was killed in the opening hours of the conflict, and since then, the U.S. has systematically targeted Iran's command structure.
Yes, using precision munitions to wipe out the top brass.
Exactly, aiming for immediate, catastrophic paralysis. But that paralysis never actually came.
It didn't. Instead of crumbling, Iran immediately announced a state of total war and transitioned straight into a decentralized command structure.
Wait, hold on. I want to look at the logistics of that for a second because it sounds very counterintuitive. If you wipe out the entire upper echelon of military command in a matter of hours, how does the military not just instantly collapse into infighting?
Well, that is the assumption, right?
Yeah, I mean, how does a local commander in a city like Isfahan or Mashhad even know what to do without a central hub in Tehran giving them orders?
That is the brilliance of decentralized command. The assumption that a military requires constant top-down communication to function is a very Western, highly centralized way of thinking. Iran actually spent the last 2 decades preparing for exactly this scenario.
Because they knew they could never match U.S. air superiority.
Precisely. They knew the sky would belong to America. In practice, this decentralization means that every single region in a country, roughly 3 times the size of Iraq, now has its own autonomous directives and its own chain of command.
So they were basically operating on standing orders.
Yes. If communication is severed, the local commander just assumes total authority over their theater. You can flatten Tehran all you want, you can destroy the fiber optic hubs, but the war simply splinters and continues from 1,000 different locations. You just cannot decapitate a hydra that was designed from the ground up to operate without a head.
Which brings up a really fascinating, totally overlooked reality of this decapitation strategy. Based on the reports, by killing off those top leaders, America actually solved one of Iran's biggest pre-war problems.
The internal political friction.
Right.
If we look at the socio-political landscape of Iran before a single bomb dropped, it was a system heavily clogged with bureaucratic deadwood. You had incredibly complex competing power centers. There's the traditional regular army constantly vying for resources against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
The IRGC.
Exactly. Plus the political clerics and the parliament layered on top of all that. It was a web of politicians paralyzed by infighting and ideological agendas.
So people who got their jobs through political maneuvering rather than actual strategic competence.
Right. And then the U.S. executes a massive decapitation strike. In a matter of hours, a huge swath of that political and military leadership is simply wiped off the board.
They effectively cleared the deadwood for them.
They did. By wiping out large swaths of leadership, the surviving leaders who step into the vacuum are naturally the most ruthless, capable, and determined tacticians.
So the U.S., ironically, streamlined Iran's leadership into a leaner, meaner machine. The surviving commanders in these pockets aren't worried about political optics anymore. They are purely focused on survival.
It is a massive strategic miscalculation based on fundamentally misunderstanding the adversary.
Which naturally leads us to America's second move, and this is where the data gets incredibly grim. With the localized command structures dug in, the U.S. has pivoted heavily to air supremacy and siege warfare. Essentially, carpet bombing everything.
Yes, leaning heavily into what strategists call soft targeting.
Which is just a sterile word for hitting civilian infrastructure, right?
Unfortunately, yes. The strategic goal isn't to destroy a military base. The goal is to make daily life so entirely unbearable that the society simply collapses or overthrows the government out of sheer desperation.
I want to break down the factual reporting from the ground to understand the scale of this. In just 6 days, data confirms that at least 7 medical centers have been hit. Over 3,000 residential homes have been completely destroyed.
It is devastating.
528 commercial centers have taken heavy damage. They struck the Tehran Grand Bazaar and even hit the Golestan Palace, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And on top of that, water and electricity grids are hit, forcing severe conservation measures on day 6.
We also have to discuss the specific tactical execution of these strikes, specifically the widespread use of double-tap strikes.
Oh yeah, let's clarify the mechanics of that for a second.
It is an impartial fact that striking a target, waiting for first responders and civilians to rush into the rubble to help, and then striking that exact same location again is explicitly illegal under international law.
The goal being maximum fear.
Exactly. It sends a message that no one is...
Look at this historically. Does bombing civilians into submission ever actually work? I mean, think about the British during the Blitz in World War II. The Luftwaffe pounded London relentlessly to break their spirit, and it just forged an ironclad national resolve.
Or the Vietnamese under decades of U.S. bombing.
Exactly. You drop millions of tons of explosives, destroy their homes and schools, and it just hardens a population's will. It doesn't break it.
And this connects directly to the sociological backfire happening right now, which is tied to Iran's pre-war demographics. Before the war, there was a massive divide between the urban and rural populations.
Right, the progressive cities versus the conservative countryside.
Precisely. In cities like Tehran, Isfahan, and Shiraz, you had progressive, secular, protesting urbanites who were fundamentally at odds with the conservative government. Conversely, the rural populations in the villages were heavily religious and fiercely loyal to the regime.
So these two groups basically hated each other.
Yes. But carpet bombing the cities destroys the homes of the very urbanites who might have actually supported regime change or welcomed American intervention.
Oh, wow. So suddenly that progressive student who was protesting the Ayatollah a month ago loses their home to an American bomb.
And in that moment of trauma, they no longer view the Iranian regime as their primary threat. They view America as the enemy.
So the progressive city dweller and the religious villager are now completely united in fury against a common enemy. The U.S. is literally manufacturing a unified populace.
It is a textbook illustration of a tactical operation causing a massive strategic catastrophe.
Which brings us to a crucial conceptual framework to explain why this keeps happening. I want to introduce you to the Law of Asymmetry to explain why empires consistently make these exact blunders.
The Law of Asymmetry is vital here. It explains the inherent advantages of both the empire and the underdog, and how the empire's advantages internally rot over time.
Let's break down the empire side first. You have 3 main advantages: mass, organization, and depth. Let's start with mass.
Mass refers to huge populations and vast resources, but over time this leads to inequality, debt, and unmotivated citizens. They just don't want to sacrifice their lives for an imperial project. And we see this factually right now. 6 U.S. soldiers have already been killed in this conflict.
Just 6 casualties, and it is already raising immediate public tolerance questions back home.
Precisely. That incredibly low threshold for tolerance highlights the rot of mass. Next is organization, which means complex bureaucracy and tech integration.
But that creates self-serving leaders, factionalism, and extreme political polarization, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. And a stark fact illustrating this is that the U.S. Senate just failed to pass a war powers resolution to constrain President Trump's authority.
And we bring that up neutrally, just to emphasize the deep political dysfunction. The legislative system is so gridlocked, it cannot even agree on how to manage a war they are currently fighting.
Exactly. And the third imperial advantage is depth, the ability to absorb massive financial or material losses. But depth breeds a very dangerous arrogance. Because there are no immediate consequences for failure, the empire stops learning and just repeats the exact same errors.
Okay, so contrast that with the underdog. The underdog doesn't have massive wealth or legislative depth. But because they are forged in survival, they have three potent traits: energy, openness, and cohesion.
Energy, because they are highly motivated by the threat of annihilation. Openness, because they are forced to innovate rapidly without rigid bureaucracy. And cohesion, because they're united by a common enemy.
And when you look at history, this makes total sense.
It is everywhere in history. Persia's massive empire losing to the smaller Greek city-states. Alexander the Great conquering Persia with a highly agile tribal army. The Romans starting as a cohesive tribe that dismantled larger kingdoms. You see it with the Vikings, the Mongols.
So based on the law of asymmetry, Iran is undeniably becoming more energetic, more open to tactical innovation, and way more cohesive. According to the historical data, the underdog is heavily favored here.
They are executing exactly what underdogs historically do to survive.
Which brings us to America's third major move, and this one is designed to literally turn Iran against itself, arming the minorities.
This is essentially the Libya and Syria playbook. You bomb from above with air supremacy, and you arm ethnic insurgents from within to fracture the country along sectarian lines.
And we need a factual breakdown of the demographics here, because Iran is actually only 50% Persian. The U.S. is explicitly targeting three border regions right now.
First is the Northwest, targeting the Kurds.
Right. Verified reporting shows the CIA is arming Kurdish forces. 5 parties have actually formed a coalition called Operation Roaring Lion, with Peshmerga fighters actively striking the border.
Then in the southeast, U.S. officials are holding talks with Balak militia leaders to stir up an insurgency there.
And up north, you have the Azerbaijan border. The chaos of this war opens the door for a greater Azerbaijan movement to basically tear away a massive chunk of resource-rich territory.
But here's the civilizational backfire. By attempting to fracture the nation, the U.S. is accidentally activating a dormant superpower. Pure Persian nationalism.
Right, because the regime had previously suppressed Persian identity in favor of a pan-Islamic one, right?
Yeah.
They wanted everyone to see themselves as Muslims first, not Persians.
Exactly. They downplayed the legacy of ancient Persian empires. But the moment you have a foreign superpower visibly backing minorities to literally carve up the map, it reminds the Persian population of their 5,000-year-old continuous civilization.
So instead of fracturing Iran, the U.S. is accidentally activating cultural pride on a massive civilizational scale. Yes. Wow. So that is 3 for 3. Kill the leaders, bomb the cities, arm the minorities. All 3 moves are actively backfiring.
Which leaves America deeply exposed by 3 fatal weaknesses.
Let's dive deep into those. The first one is political will.
The motivation gap is massive. For Iran, this is an existential fight for literal survival. For America, the public simply does not want it, and as we noted, the Senate is already trying to halt it just a week in.
The second fatal weakness is manufacturing. Let's use the math here. The U.S. is firing a $1 million precision missile to shoot down a $50,000 drone. That is completely unsustainable.
And America offshored its factories to China decades ago. The U.S. simply cannot sustain a long, high-intensity war, and ramping up that specialized production could take 5 years they simply do not have.
And that leads directly to the third fatal weakness: casualties. Because there is zero public support, every single coffin destroys whatever political support remains.
And Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth basically admitted this vulnerability. He stated, and I quote, "You don't have to roll 200,000 people in there and stay for 20 years.
That quote is wild. It proves they know unequivocally that they cannot occupy Iran. A ground invasion is politically impossible.
Sizing this up, America is entirely trapped between an aerial strategy that doesn't work because air power alone never wins wars against dug-in adversaries, and a ground invasion alternative that it simply cannot afford.
So let's flip the board to Iran's counter-strategy.
Yeah.
The game plan is classic guerrilla warfare. Hide, seek, and be a relentless pain in the ass.
That is exactly it. Hide in the Zagros Mountains during the bombings, and then emerge to attack soft Gulf allies with incredibly cheap weapons.
We have the factual breakdown on this. Iran has already fired over 400 ballistic missiles and nearly 1,000 drones at Gulf states. They are hitting Dubai, Bahrain, Saudi oil fields. They are actively trying to close the Strait of Hormuz.
And they do this using a tactic called Mosaic defense.
I want to explain this term to you, the listener, because it is fascinating.
Instead of using large, centralized military formations that satellites can easily spot and bomb, Iran uses incredibly small, independent cells.
The tiles of the mosaic.
Right. And these cells use mobile launchers deliberately disguised as ordinary civilian traffic. A delivery truck pulls over. launches a swarm of drones, and instantly melts back into the civilian traffic pattern. U.S. satellites simply cannot track them. It is like trying to catch smoke.
And this relentless harassment leads to the ultimate bait. Iran actually wants a ground invasion.
They desperately want American boots on the ground.
Right. Stepping into the Iranian mountains turns it into Afghanistan ×3, against a religiously motivated, civilizationally united enemy fighting for their literal homes.
The U.S. wants to believe a 4 to 5 week air campaign will work, but 4,000 years of military history say otherwise.
Now, we have to acknowledge America's hidden advantages, but explain why they are actually traps. We are looking at technology, propaganda, and money. Let's start with tech.
Advanced weapons create dangerous dependency.
It's like students relying entirely on ChatGPT, right? It doesn't make you smarter. It makes you lazy. It kills the creative, out-of-the-box innovation you desperately need for asymmetric warfare.
That is a perfect analogy. Then you have propaganda. Controlling the global narrative through massive news networks and algorithms seems like a strength.
But it kills internal debate.
Exactly. If no one in the system can safely say, this strategy is failing, the feedback loop completely breaks. You end up with sheer arrogance and repeated errors.
And the third trap is money. Printing unlimited dollars to bribe insurgents backfires because mercenaries totally like loyalty. They just take the cash and disappear into the mountains when things get tough.
You cannot purchase existential societal cohesion.
So if the military logic fails, the manufacturing isn't there, and it makes zero strategic sense, the question nobody is asking is, why is this war happening at all?
We have to evaluate the official narratives neutrally here. President Trump stated that nuclear talks had failed. But verified reporting shows Iran was actually willing to agree to all U.S. terms regarding their nuclear program.
And then Secretary of State Marco Rubio claimed they needed to preempt an imminent Israeli strike.
Which is circular logic. Starting a massive regional war to prevent a regional war doesn't explain the scale of this escalation.
Which brings us to a bombshell revelation. I want to introduce journalist John Larson's recent reporting. A formal complaint was just filed by 16 active-duty U.S. soldiers, most of them practicing Christians.
And this complaint details a mandatory combat readiness briefing where their commanding officer explicitly called the war part of God's divine plan.
Its commander referenced the book of Revelation, literally stating that Trump was anointed by Jesus to light the signal fire in Iran to intentionally trigger Armageddon and the second coming.
And this is where game theory completely shatters.
How so?
Game theory assumes you're dealing with rational actors who want material, geopolitical wins, they want land, resources, security. But if decision makers are genuinely playing for religious prophecy, if the goal isn't to win, but to cause maximum destruction and chaos to fulfill an end-of-days prophecy, then the U.S. strategy actually makes terrifying sense.
Wow. So a strategy that looks entirely irrational and self-destructive is actually working perfectly to achieve that specific apocalyptic goal.
Exactly. You cannot apply rational geopolitical metrics to apocalyptic intent.
So, bringing it all together for the verdict, I want to ask the ultimate question for you. Whose strategy is better?
On the fundamentals of game theory, setting aside the apocalyptic variables, it is clearly Iran.
America's moves streamline, unify, and galvanize Iran. Meanwhile, Iran's guerrilla warfare and Mosaic defense perfectly exploit America's lack of political will and manufacturing gap.
But we must add nuance here. Iran is not invincible. Their arrogance cost them their entire navy in the opening hours. Mountain fortresses become dark, freezing prisons without utilities. And that awakened nationalism can easily curdle into blinding religious zealotry.
But despite those weaknesses, Iran's strategy is far better suited for this specific conflict. The tragedy is that empires rarely admit mistakes. They double down until reality forces them to stop, which is usually way too late.
The mass and depth blind them to the underdog's cohesion.
And that wraps up the second deep dive of our End of the World series. We put intense research, academic analysis, and verified reporting into providing an independent, sponsor-free picture of this conflict for you.
If you value this work, please direct your support and get exclusive regional updates at buymecoffee.com /Voz to the World.
Coming up next time, we will preview exactly what this war means for your money and how historical parallels can be used to predict the exact next steps of this conflict. You won't want to miss it. But before we go, we want to leave you with one final deeply provocative thought that we didn't fully cover today.
If the true underlying motivation for some key players isn't geopolitical dominance, but rather fulfilling an end-of-days prophecy, how do traditional peace treaties even work? You can negotiate over land, and you can negotiate over oil. But how do you negotiate a ceasefire with an adversary whose ultimate win condition is the literal end of the world?
Think about that. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and share the show, and we'll see you next time.